Okay, so today we are going to introduce a little bit of a series that I've been thinking of doing and collecting notes on doing, and it's all about studies and what the studies are, just like a very brief overview, and why they're important and what things you can extrapolate from them and how they might be useful, kind of focusing more on the utility and takeaways more so than the studies themselves. But for the first day, I thought I would talk about why studies can be bad, or one of the ways in which they can be bad. And the inspiration for this is I was actually looking for information on one of my studies, and I found out that the study, when they tried to replicate it, didn't look so hot. So there are four things that come to mind that can make studies bad. I'm not saying that these are the only four, but these four in particular come to mind for me. And so the first is non-representative samples. A lot of times, well, we'll get into that. The second is replicability. The third is placebo / poor controls / poor construction of, your study. And then the fourth is perverse incentives. Okay, let's jump into the non-representative samples one. So a lot of studies, particularly in psychology, which are going to be a lot of the studies I talk about, are done on college students. And then they are extrapolated and say, this is how people think. And the truth is that's not how people think. That's how college students think. And so what you need to do is you need to make sure that if you're going to have a population that you're going to say something about, if you want to guarantee the study really covers what will happen in that population, you need to take a random sample from that population. So if you wanted to say that people in the United States have this certain psychological characteristic, you would have to not test just college students. You would have to test a random sample from all people across the United States. This kind of thing is particularly noticeable in polls, where sometimes polling data can be quite bad if a certain group that is very likely to vote, for example, really doesn't like talking to pollsters. Right? Because you cannot get an accurate sample of the people who are going to vote if they distrust pollsters or don't like pollsters. This is particularly the case in psychology. It's also the case in fitness, where a lot of the studies are done with complete beginners, or just your average person. And these studies, the results of these studies cannot be extrapolated for athletes, for example, or not necessarily. You have to take them with a grain of salt, and you have to, make a sort of judgment as to what's going to be effective. There's a lot of people in the strength community who value anecdotes more than studies, and the main reason why is there aren't really studies done with world-class athletes. And if there are studies done with world-class athletes, they're case studies, right? And the sample size is small. It's like a sample of it's sometimes just a singular athlete. And so this is one of the ways in which studies can be particularly bad. But for our purposes, a lot of it is going to be looking at college students and noticing that it only necessarily applies to college students. So you have to take it with a grain of salt a little bit. Although you can infer that it can apply to other groups, it doesn't. That's not what the study actually says or what it actually applies to, right? If you have a study about college students, it probably means something about other people, but it doesn't necessarily. Okay, the second thing is replicability, and this is the one I got into trouble with the study I was looking at. And I'll talk about three studies for this, or three things for this. The first is, there was this study that was done where the experimenters tricked someone into holding a pencil between their teeth in order to force them to smile without them knowing that they're smiling. Okay? So a little something like this. Right, you're pulling the cheeks back, and they also trick them into frowning by making them purse their lips around the pencil. And the idea is, what they wanted to test was, will smiling make you happier, and will frowning make you sadder? I think that they were testing specifically for laughter or how amusing they found something. I can't quite recall. But then there was this, and what they found was it makes a huge difference. And so I've read about this study, and so one of the interventions I've done is find mechanisms or ways to force myself to smile more that are like not very invasive for my life. So one of the things I like to do is flavored toothpicks, is to stick them between my teeth when I'm driving, like this. The idea being it forces me to smile, so it makes me happier. The problem is, or what I recently discovered is there was a meta-analysis of like 17 other studies that didn't quite replicate this exact study. Like they weren't copying the exact study, but they were doing something similar. And they found tricking someone to smile doesn't really have any effect. Or it's very, very marginal at best. Not the huge effect that the initial study reported. And so I think it was like it's not statistically significant, but it is like slightly pushed in the degree of happiness. And and this is an important thing to emphasize, is that this study with the pencil and the teeth and the smiling thing is in tons and tons of books. And so it is really permeated into like, I don't want to say the cultural narrative, but perhaps like the intellectual narrative in terms of, books that are written in the realm of psychology. It's like, it's a common study to be referenced. And this brings up an important thing is that what makes studies effective, or what makes the experimental method effective, is the entire ecosystem around studies, where you are trying to prove your theory false, and if you can't prove it false, then it's going to be true. And so you have to ask yourself, what way could I prove this false? And then you try and prove it false, and if you can't prove it false, then, Karl Popper, falsifiability. And so you need this supporting ecosystem and not just have the study on their own in order to really validate the study. And one of the problems is that there isn't incentive to try and validate other people's stuff. So if someone makes an outlandish study, there is incentive to proving them wrong. So if you think they're wrong, going out and repeating their study to show that they're wrong, there is some incentive for that. But if you think they're right, there's really not much. You don't get that much when you replicate someone else's study. You prove that they were right. They continue to just get, their glory. Instead, what you have is like doing spin-off studies that are somewhat similar. There's some incentive for that, but even still, there's not a lot of incentive to do this. But this is really important because this is how you know that the studies are good. And so, okay. Let's talk about the other two examples because I think they are worthwhile. The second is this study that was done where they took 2 containers of rice. On one of the containers of rice, they wrote like love or happiness or something like this. And on another container of rice, they wrote hate or sadness or something like this. And what they did is they checked to see how quickly the rice went bad. And the one with rice, the rice that had love written on it went bad slower than the one that had like evil written on it. And they're like, look at this. What this is this has to do, and like the extrapolation, which is in the movie What the Fuck Do We Know, that references this study. And this is like a somewhat big movie, or it's like, it gets referenced in philosophy discussions somewhat, much to my chagrin. It makes this like quantum theory type of argument that's like very pseudoscientific, that argues that our belief is changing the rice, and because we wrote love on it, our human belief is manifesting the reality of this rice. Something like this. Okay. People tried to replicate that rice study, and they couldn't do it. For them, it had no effect. Like what you wrote on the container didn't make a difference. And so it's not particularly surprising, at least to me, but there's a problem because you have that initial study, and then obviously someone makes a movie that like heavily relies on this study that wasn't properly like vetted in terms of replication. And so perhaps the problem is not as much the study itself on its own, although like obviously it's problematic if no one could replicate it, but when someone finds a sensational sort of thing and just runs with it into the like cultural narrative and never bothers to ask, well, has this been replicated? Like, how certain are we of this? You can't be 100% certain of a study, especially if it hasn't been replicated. Another one that comes to mind, and this is going to disappoint the winos, is there was a guy who was publishing all these studies about how healthy wine is. Resveratrol is the best, and he was showing all these like health benefits from the intervention of introducing more wine into a person's diet. And he did a lot of studies, and then it turns out, I can't recall his name. I'm sure you can look it up. It turns out he was falsifying his data sets. And so, obviously there were a ton of studies, but if they're all done by one guy, and he has some sort of incentive for having a particular outcome, then you're going to have some problems. Which brings us to the third, the third thing is that oftentimes the studies have perverse incentives, or the finding of the truth is not what informs what funds or motivates the studies as much as it is finding particular outcomes. And this is particularly noticeable in one good example is the sugar industry or sugar related industries, so primarily snack companies that make Oreos or whatever. I don't know, I'm not talking Oreos specifically, I'm just saying snack companies that make those types of snacks really heavy on the sugar. They sponsored a lot of the studies that show why saturated fat is so bad for you. And this is important to note a little bit later with the nutrition and construction of studies, but it's pretty obvious that they want a particular outcome. If saturated fat is what makes people fat, then you don't need to worry about the sugar. And this is kind of an argument you can make if there's a bunch of people like bagging on saturated fat. Another example of perverse incentives is the companies that fund a lot of the studies on how good pharmaceutical intervention is for like psychological stuff is the pharmaceutical companies themselves. And in particular, what stands out to me is antidepressants, and this gets referenced in Johan Hari's book Lost Connections, where he overall makes the argument that says, look, the solution is not medication. It's not a chemical imbalance. What it is being disconnected socially from other people and from nature and from yourself and this types of stuff. And he makes the argument that it's about disconnection. That's a bit of a more extended type of thing. But in it, he talks about how, they did this study involving using placebos, and what they found was if the efficacy of antidepressants, half of it is placebo. So you could give someone a sugar pill and they'll get most of the effect of the antidepressant. More than that, 25% is them just getting better on their own, because people tend to, generally speaking, events often cause depression, and then depression just goes away over time. This isn't true for everyone. I'm just saying that it's certainly not true for a lot of people, but it is a thing where people will get better naturally, because people also get worse naturally. It's just an ebb and flow of your environment. And so, okay. Then there is the last quarter, which is the actual effect of the drug. And recently there was a meta-analysis that was published that was kind of going against the serotonin hypothesis, which is that it's serotonin. I haven't dug into that. My understanding is it's pretty damning. I know that if you use a drug that increases serotonin, it reduces depression. And if you use a drug that decreases serotonin, it reduces depression. And so it doesn't seem like it matters what you do to the serotonin. But both will reduce depression. And so, but then you go ask, well, okay, then why do we have all these studies that show how great SSRIs are? And it's well, who's funding these studies? And this isn't meant to be dismissive of the experimental method and studies writ large, because I still think they're important, but it's important to emphasize that there are incentives, and certain people have incentives to, have certain outcomes. Another thing that comes to mind is, and this is a study that Johann Hari references a lot, where there's no sort of follow-up for the rat park study because there's not financial incentive for it. And so the rat park study is like this. The first study that the rat park study was kind of a response to was, if you take rats and you put them in a cage and you give them water and cocaine water, they will take the cocaine water until they die. Or maybe it was heroin. It might have been heroin water. It doesn't really matter. They will just do the drug until they die. And the argument that the people who made the study, they're like, look how terrible these drugs are. These drugs make you so addicted you'll just use them until you death. And it's like, okay, maybe the drug is so addictive that it does that. Or maybe there's something else going on. So what this guy did is he made this rat park, which was a fantasy land for rats. There's other rats. You can socialize. There's tons of stimulus. There's a bunch of stuff to play on. There's play with, all these sorts of things. And then he puts, the water bottle with the cocaine / heroin / meth, whatever it was, and the regular water bottle. And it turns out they barely touch the drug water bottle. They just drink from the non-drug water bottle, and they go about their day and they love their life because they have a stimulating environment. And this is, this is the rat park study. And then the guy who did the rat park study complained because he was kind of shut down from doing anything else or pursuing anything else along that vein, because there's not much pressure to say, or actually there's pressure to not say, hey, maybe the drugs aren't so addictive. Maybe it just has to do with people's lives sucking, and that's why they're doing all the drugs. And this is not above board or what the university really wants to be saying. And so the guy was unable to really get funding for any sorts of follow-ups on that study. And the study gets referenced somewhat often in books, but Johann Hari is a big champion of that particular study. And you can find kind of his general narrative as to drugs not being, physically addictive, and it's more about your environment in his book Chasing the Scream, which I reviewed recently. But okay, the idea is, overall, a lot of the studies that get done, even if nobody's falsifying data sets and these sorts of things, the studies that get chosen to get done is informed by people with interests. And the studies that get chosen to get published is informed by people with interests. And so pharmaceutical companies will not publish studies that show that their drug is ineffective. They will only publish the ones that show that they're effective, or they won't publish the ones that show their drug is dangerous or whatever. They'll only show the ones that say that it's safe. And so there's this selection bias that is not intrinsically problematic with studies themselves, but just the problems with the very real considerations and just how reality works and just the practical institution of studies. You have this problem of perverse incentives, where there's probably a complete lack of studies on how healthy marijuana can be as an intervention for a variety of things, because you can't put a patent on marijuana, right? And something that's making a big comeback right now is psilocybin and mushrooms used as a therapeutic intervention. And my understanding is that it's kind of a high risk intervention, but it's generally really effective, and then occasionally horrifically bad. That's my understanding. And then, so let's get into the fourth one, which is, placebo and poor controls, poor construction of studies. And this is just, sometimes you can't construct a study that really gets at what you want to get at. And so, the big one to talk about is nutrition, I think. Because for nutrition, it is incredibly hard to actually create an experimental design study because people will not adhere to the diet you give them over a long period of time. There's basically no nutritional experimental data that's super long term. It's just all correlative. Where they ask you what you eat, you report what you eat, and they just correlate it with other things. It's not them giving you specific diets, and then you have that diet, because you could not possibly get a large cohort to do that over 2 decades if you really wanted to find out what diet is effective over 2 decades. And so you have all these confounding variables with a lot of the diet studies where, it might be that being a vegetarian makes you more healthy, or it might just happen that the people who tend to be vegetarians tend to do a bunch of stuff in their life that makes them healthier, right? And this is important to emphasize, is that the person who eats a bunch of vegetables, let's say, is probably more likely to exercise and probably more likely to take a multivitamin. And you can't separate out what exactly is causing the health when there are other variables in play, which is why you have to have an experimental design study. You have to take someone who is perhaps not working out and not taking a multivitamin and then force them to be a vegetarian. But you can't really do that with diet studies because no one's going to adhere for 2 decades to see what's up. And so all the diet studies, or like all the dieting grand narratives, and this is just perverse and hilarious, they tend to correlate all of their, let's say, they all use correlative data, correlating with like the same data set of America getting fat over the last 50 years. And then they all point their fingers at different things. They point their fingers at saturated fat. They point their fingers at sugar. They point their fingers at carbs entirely, and they point their fingers at animal products. And they're like, look, they're eating more animal products and people are getting fatter. Look, they're eating more sugar and people are getting fatter. Look, they're eating more saturated fat and people are getting fatter. Look, they're eating more carbohydrates and people are getting fatter. And it's like, well, maybe people are just eating more and they're getting fatter. Like, it's just more entirely. And like, this is what drives the thing. And it's more complicated than that. And I'm not trying to argue that like, it's just people like, eating more. I think also a big part of it is like has to do with economics and like being in low income areas makes it harder to eat healthy and like this type of stuff, and it's like nuanced and it's complex. But the point I'm trying to say is they all correlate with like the same like type of data set where like it's very formulaic, which is like, look, the past 40-50 years has been a catastrophe and we know what to point our finger at, and they all point their finger at something else and they're all using the same destination for saying, look how terrible this is, and they all point at something else, and like it fits because it's all correlative, because you can't construct good studies on nutrition just because the practical, like, it's just impractical to like say, oh, we're going to make this person do keto for 20 years and just hope they adhere. There's going to be too many people dropping out of the studies. It's going to be horrendously expensive. You just can't do it. Another example I have is acupuncture, but I don't think this quite comes up as that great. Oh, okay. Talking about placebo. A lot of things are effective. And a lot of things are effective because of the placebo effect. And what comes to mind is acupuncture in particular comes to mind. And they've done studies where they have people prick you like where your chakras are or whatever it is. And then they prick you in random places. And it turns out both are actually incredibly effective at reducing pain. But what this means is that acupuncture doesn't actually reduce your pain. It's your belief that your pain will be reduced. And pain is actually the probably the thing where the placebo effect is most profound in. And so like hypnosis is extremely effective at pain reduction. Acupuncture is going to be effective. Chiropractor is going to be effective. And you have all these things, and there's 2 layers to this sort of what I'm talking about here in regards to the placebos. One is, if something works because of the placebo effect, it works. And so I sometimes get into arguments with people who are, let's say, critical of like acupuncture, and they're like, oh, it's a scam, it doesn't work. And it's like, what are you talking about, my guy? It definitely works. Like, it clearly reduces pain. The question is that, or the thing is, it just doesn't reduce pain more than a placebo. But just because something doesn't reduce pain more than a placebo doesn't mean it's not reducing pain. And then the second part is, it's not beating a placebo. And so, a lot of times, if studies are constructed poorly, they will allow the placebo effect to look like it's doing something when it's really, or sorry, they will allow it to look like something meaningful is doing something when it's really just the placebo. Like, for example, the antidepressants. Half the effect of antidepressants is the placebo. If you construct a study where you give one group nothing and you give the other group the antidepressant, they're going to, like, the antidepressant's going to look so effective, which is why you need to have a third group where you give them a fake pill that's not the antidepressant. Most studies do this, but I'm just saying, like, you can have poorly constructed studies that fail to really test for what you're testing for. Another thing that comes to mind, and I'm actually unsure of what the literature looks like on protein powder post-workout. I just know that more recent studies have said that there's not really much such a thing as a protein window. It's not essential that you have protein like immediately post-workout. And so I'm just going to speculate what the studies initially could have looked like and what something like this. I'm not saying this is the case. I'm just like saying this could be the case. Let's say you have these initial studies where you make this protein window argument. First of all, if you have people that are, let's say, ingesting 200 grams of protein a day, and then you give them 30 grams post-workout, and you give the control group nothing, then of course the people ingesting 230 grams are going to have an advantage, but they're ingesting more protein. It's not necessarily the window. It could be the protein. Okay, so you have to give them both 230 grams. Another thing I've heard is that it is important to space out your protein throughout the day. Now, the spacing is different than post-workout, right? So if you have, let's say, 6 meals a day, and you have protein at all those meals, great. If you suddenly add a 7th meal immediately post-workout, and you still ingest the same amount of protein throughout the day, well, then there's a confounding variable and you have more meals. And so what you need to do in order to test about the protein window is you need to have someone who is having their protein before their workout and having someone with their protein after the workout and asking, is there like a difference? Because you need to have this person eating the same amount of meals a day, because the amount of meals a day, the amount of times they eat protein, that might be the important thing, not the window immediately post-workout. But it's stuff like this where it can be easy to go wrong in like the construction of the study, where you learn that you're not really testing for what you think you're testing for, and there's something else going on. And so these four altogether, kind of in my mind, are pretty good examples of why, replicability is like a big one too. I talked about it already, so perhaps I shouldn't go into it some more. I'm just thinking of how things can go poorly in studies, even though studies, overall the experimental method is great, right? Because you are trying to reduce anecdotes and bias. And overall it's fantastic. But it doesn't mean you get to just read what the study says and then turn your brain off, right? You still have to engage in critical thinking and ask, is this study good? Another thing is, statistical significance, where if you have a very, very, very small effect and a very large sample size, you will get statistical significance, even though it's not a significant effect in terms of worthy of an intervention of that sort of thing. And this has to do with just more understanding statistical analysis, which is not something the layperson necessarily does. I think that statistics should be required in high school over any type of math, except for that what's required for taking statistics, just because being able to understand studies is really important. because I think that they are important, because this is how you get at the truth, not because it guarantees the truth, but just because it's the best way. I mean, I've just spent the last like half hour talking about how you can fail to get at the truth, but overall, just because it's not a foolproof method doesn't mean it's a bad method. Anecdote in general will be worse than study unless you are in a situation where like you can't have a study, and this happens quite often. You can't have a study for your particular like social group, for example, and so like just in terms of like socialization, I guess, you're not going to have studies for your particular body in terms of what responds to what in terms of exercise, nutrition, sleep, like these types of things. And so you should, read the studies and be like, okay, I'll try this out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this is going to be the best way of going about things. What stands out, like, in particular is that, like, at the end, like, people are individuals, so, like, you still have to, like, take that into consideration. Like, the college student's not necessarily a representative sample of you, on, like, multiple, like, levels. So, I think the main takeaway here is I'm going to be talking more about studies. Overall, studies are good, but they should be taken with a grain of salt. Just like everything and every piece of information, you need to examine more than just one piece of information instead of reading like the study and being like, aha, we have the answer, folks. You should just look at a study and say, okay, this is probably the answer. And if you're skeptical, look for how the study can be wrong. And if you are completely on board, even maybe still consider how the study can be wrong. I was going to talk about the pencil and teeth study today, and instead I find myself talking about, replicability and why the pencil and teeth study was wrong. Although I think this is, since I'm not going to make another video on the pencil and teeth study, I think it's very important to emphasize that I've been engaging in this, like, teeth smiling practice. I still think it's effective. I just no longer think it's effective on the basis of the smiling. I think it's effective because of placebo. And I'm still going to do it because it's effective. It has been effective for me throughout, like, the time I've been doing it. And that doesn't, just because it's not effective, like, biomechanically, and it's, like, because it's effective psychologically, it doesn't mean I should stop doing it. It's just like the acupuncture. Just because it doesn't beat the placebo, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it doesn't beat the placebo. So I will continue to stick a pencil between my teeth, or toothpick, flavored toothpick. The brand, if anyone was interested, it's Tea Tree Therapy, and these are cinnamon flavored. I don't really have a study to support sticking them between your teeth to force you to smile, but I can tell you that if you think it's effective, it will be. Even though it won't be if you just did it randomly and didn't know and were tricked into doing it, like how they did in the experiment. You'll probably achieve a null hypothesis. As far as discussion goes, does anyone have any examples of studies that were proven wrong, particularly poorly constructed, anything like this, studies that are bad for any reason? I would love to hear it in the comments. Feel free to do the YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe. I think that's just the only one. Oh, share. So doing the YouTube algo stuff at the end of videos always feels weird because, like, I feel like it's implied, and I've discussed this before. I feel like it's implied, but I also, like, it just has to be effective because everyone does it. But at the same time, it's just, like, it's this very performative, like, type of thing where it just seems very inauthentic. It's just, like, this extra add-on. Because the content creator really doesn't want to say, like, comment, subscribe a million times. The people consuming it don't want to hear it a million plus times. And instead, it's just this, kowtowing to the nature of the beast, where it's supposed to be effective, so everyone does it. And the consumer understands that it's supposed to be effective, so they let it. They're like, okay, well, I know the shtick, but it seems like if nobody did it, maybe everyone would be better off. I don't know. Yeah, perhaps it just adds to the noise. Certainly, this discussion might add to the noise unless you find it interesting. But, anyways, I think I'm starting to ramble. So have a good one.